All right, welcome everybody. We've got another episode of, I don't know, what do we call this? Film and Theory, Theory and Film, Adam and Matt, something like that. The Fox and the Hedgehog, something along those lines. So this week we're gonna talk about why fantasy is weird and what were the weird things that happened last week. You can find more details on that with Adam's article, Dynasty and Theory at Football Guys. We'll talk a little Brian Thomas and what I saw this past week after studying his film off of the awful week that he had against the Bengals and whether that's something people should panic about. So Adam, I mean, let's kick it off. Fantasy's weird. I mean, we kind of know that, but why specifically in this chapter?
Well, I would say the title of the article is Fantasy is Weird, but that doesn't mean other things are not also weird. I was saying to you before the show that some might argue that if something is not weird, it's not really worth engaging with in the first place. What is the point? But fantasy, this hobby that we know and love, is weird in that it is very heavily dominated by randomness. We talk about that a lot. And because it's very heavily dominated by randomness, you get some just truly bizarre stuff happening over small sample sizes. Classic example that I will always remember and always reference. In 2011, in my Dynasty League, there was a team that snuck into the playoffs with the second fewest points scored in the entire league, had really crazy schedule luck, snuck into the playoffs, and then had the highest scoring playoff run in our league's history and won the championship because of stuff like Darius Hayward-Bay, who did absolutely entire career, except for those 3 specific weeks, he just went Nova. And so he's riding like Darius Hayward-Bay and like Brent Selleck. And that was Julio Jones' rookie year. And obviously Julio would go on to be a superstar, but he started that year like really slow and then just like went incandescent during the fantasy playoffs. And this guy walked away with the title forever. And it's obviously we all intuitively know this when if we're going to do some deep cuts here, when Friesman Jackson, who was the Browns like 8th wide receiver / emergency like Hail Mary specialist, because their quarterback's arm wasn't strong enough, so they had a specialist where if they were ever in a Hail Mary situation, they put Friesman Jackson in at quarterback and just have him chuck the ball as far as he could. Friesman Jackson had this huge game in week 1, and people are debating, like, is Friesman Jackson going to be a thing now? But when that happens in like week 11, it's very easy to dismiss. Like if Friesman Jackson has a huge game in week 11, we're like, well, we've got 10 weeks of Friesman Jackson being absolutely nothing and 1 week where he just went absolutely Nova. But like, that's a fluke. It's a lot harder. I always like reminding people how weird fantasy football is early in the season, because it's a lot harder when the 1 week is the only week. When the 2 weeks are all we have to go on, it's easy to lose sight of like just how much of the hobby is just randomness. And the challenge, especially for you and me as analysts, but for fantasy football players too, is that sometimes fantasy's not being weird. Miles Austin was a receiver for the Cowboys, buried on the depth chart, undrafted player, not really getting any run. He came out and had this huge 250-yard game. And people are like, well, Miles Austin, he's probably the next Friesman Jackson. And then he had like 200 yards the next week too. And then he went on to have a very long and productive career as a fantasy receiver. And so it turns out that first game was signal. And so I don't mean to be reactionary and say disbelieve everything you see. But I think for me personally, it's a very useful reminder to look at like week 11 from 2023 and look at just how much weird stuff happened on week 11 that we forgot about it because it was week 11 and we just dismissed it out of hand. And then that creates like a baseline, like this is like the standard level of weirdness. A certain amount, like that same proportion of results from week 1 and week 2, were also going to prove to be weird flukes down the line, and it's important to keep that in mind.
No, I mean that makes sense. I mean it's I think it's one of these things where, part of it too is that as you get into certain weeks, there's also more about where you can explain some of the weirdness in hindsight, but it's difficult to be able to cope with it in foresight. I mean, some of the things can be, you could look at how maybe the Browns had 2 top 15 receivers with Jameis Winston throwing the ball around, as you referenced in week 11 of 2024. and you can maybe look at the matchups and say, okay, here's why that's going to happen, or who was out, who was on the defense, what are they prone to, what matches up well. But that's the thing, is that most people playing fantasy football don't have a little notebook of all the different matchups and weaknesses and strengths with different defenses and different histories. They can go on Football Guys and look at a lot of different things, or get a stat head account and start to look up different things. But when it comes to like understanding who's prone to different, who's prone in a weakness sort of area, that becomes more difficult. I mean, like right now, people are looking at, say, the Seattle Seahawks, and they're like, well, they don't really know what they have with their two running backs, and who's gonna really actually dominate and who's not. We might just find out it's as simple as that when they play a 3-4 team, 3-4 teams are easier to run against up the middle, and that they play a 4-3 team, it's easier to run outside. That in theory that tends to work. But we may look at that as, and if it turns out to be something that simple, but something that isn't really talked about in fantasy very often, because we dominate it with data that's more box score data or advanced stats that take the box score data and do something a little different with it, then you're missing out on something simple that somebody can look at just from the film and say, yeah, well, in theory, we know that the way players are aligned in a 3-4, generally they're easier to run up the middle against, and I think that's kind of the funny and weird thing about all this too, is that there is some legitimate weirdness and it's random, and then there's stuff that we get so wrapped up in data about that we miss like the obvious. That's just like somebody's grandma whose son was a coach and she grew up watching film with him, basically, is sitting on a couch somewhere, basically being able to make fantasy predictions just because she knows the game so well from watching it. I've met some people who were literally like, yeah, my son was a coach, and yeah, this is this, and like they see it on the field and they go, they're gonna throw, and you're like sitting there and it's like there's those games in the bar where you guess pass or run and who it's gonna be to, and you get points doing that. And there's people like literally somebody's grandma who would dominate in this game just because they grew up, studying high school football or being around it so much that they learned the intricacies of the game. And you're looking at them and you're like some savant with like knitting needles. It's like unbelievable.
And randomness is one of those things where like it's a mind screw. Like it's to conceptualize randomness, because in reality, like nothing is random.
Right.
Nothing on the field, unless sorry to all of my quantum physics bros out there. Like, sure, we'll accept that on a quantum level, maybe sometimes things are random, but like Jamar Chase didn't break that tackle because of randomness. Jamar Chase broke that tackle because he is a freakishly athletic player who has devoted countless untold hours to his craft, and he's developed a certain set of skills, and the defender has also developed a certain set of skills, and like everything is the result of prior causes. But from our perspective, like a lot of stuff might as well be random. From my perspective, it doesn't matter whether Jamar Chase broke that tackle because of some unique confluence of skill in that specific matchup, or whether he broke that tackle because, quantum mechanics and it was truly random. Like, what matters is whether this is going to predict whether he's going to break other tackles in the future. And so, yeah, I always try to be very cautious about that, because I think a lot of people who are into the numbers and the statistics and the data will overstate their case. And they'll say, well, it's random that Jamar Chase had a big week. And I think that trivializes the amount of work that goes into it. And I think it trivializes the ability for us to determine the factors that led to that large week. So I try to be cautious and say, when I say something is random, what I really mean is that it is, from my perspective, for my intents and purposes, functionally random. It is not useful for predicting, or there is a large component of it that is not going to be useful for the thing that I want, which is predicting future performance. So I do I want to acknowledge the people out there who are like screaming at their screens right now and saying like, no, it's not that it was random. It's just that you didn't know. But I also want to say too that we are very, very good at explaining things. But any model that can explain everything after the fact, but predict nothing before the fact, it doesn't actually explain anything.
Right.
Like that's just a story that we're making up to tell ourselves. If Tyler Warren goes on to be terrible the rest of the year, we're going to say his early season success was because defenses didn't have any film on him. They weren't prepared for him. They didn't know what to expect. If Tyler Warren goes on to be great for the rest of the year, we're going to say, well, obviously his early season success is because he's a superior player, and that carried over. So we have an explanation at hand for every possible outcome, but that explanation is useful. That's just storytelling that we're engaging in. And so it's important that you make predictions and that you say, well, I think that Tyler Warren's going to be good, or I think that Tyler Warren's going to be bad. And you draw your line in the sand. And then it's also important that you actually check those predictions. And are they actually useful? Are they outperforming random chance? Because if not, that's probably a problem with your model. Otherwise, or it might just be a run of bad luck, because that's also random in the sense that like it's not meaningful to us for our purposes.
Yeah. And we can, or it could be Tyler Warren will demonstrate things that show why he's good. But now that defenses will look at the fact that Daniel Jones is running a one-read offense right now with a lot of schemed-up plays that, Warren is benefiting from because people are preoccupied with Jonathan Taylor and other receivers running off the defense, or he's the blocker who comes open on a boot. And so you're basically creating plays where there's one read, and that one option, that one mission is to get that one player, Tyler Warren, wide open in space. And after a while, they're going to run out of ways to disguise that or do it effectively. And defenses are going to say, okay, well, let's try and make Daniel Jones goes to his second read, and let's see if he looks as good as he does being a one-read quarterback right now in our offense, because that's a lot of what's going on right now. And we'll see if that we'll check back in that in about 8 weeks and see if we start to see a dip with Warren. I think Warren's a good player. But yeah, I feel you with your point overall, but just as a side note with that, I mean, it's kind of like, we'll move on. We'll talk a little bit about Brian Thomas. I just did a piece on him, where I watched about, probably all of the contested catches that I could query, which I, from last year and from his days at LSU. And I paid particular attention to in-breaking routes after watching the Bengals game, Adam, because, as we saw, he alligator-armed 2 passes. And this is kind of the point that I want to explore here, because you listen to people, there's a bias that people have about certain things, that if you cross a certain line, you're pretty much like, people don't like you. And they have these myths about what football players are and aren't. And one of the myths about football players is they're gladiators, and they're willing to throw their body into the fire knowing the danger full and well, and they're still going to do it heroically anyway. And if they don't do that, it offends their sensibilities. They're not tough enough. They're not
soft.
Good enough. They're soft.
It's like the worst insult you can give a football player. It's not that he's bad. It's that he's soft.
Soft, exactly. So, it's funny because you watch Brian Thomas, and there were 5 plays where he had to work across the middle, make the catch, and in his sight line there was a defender getting into his sight line as he attempted the catch, and he took a hit or was very close to taking a hit. 3 of them he made. 2 of them he alligator armed. I would say of those 2, from what I saw, one of them I would say was definitely on Trevor Lawrence, leading him. It was the very first one where he led him in the crossing route. It was the most egregious. It was one of the egregious looking ones where he reached with one hand and stopped. 2 defenders were coming from the opposite side. He tips the ball, I think, and it ends up being intercepted. Now, watching that play, contrasting with the plays where he caught the ball, Lawrence led him towards a defender, but there was enough room for him to take at least 1 or 2 steps as he hit the ground after going up for the ball to protect himself and take the hit. And he made those plays. He made all 3 of those plays like that. When he was in a situation like those 2 alligator arm situations, Trevor Lawrence was leading him into an area where there was no way he had a chance to protect himself. Now, some diehard Gladiator fans will look at that and say, it doesn't matter. We've seen Anquan Bolden and Steve Smith and Larry Fitzgerald go into harm's way. We've seen Austin Collie go into harm's way and make plays like that. Concussions be damned. And they've made the catch, or they've at least tried. But I would say all of those players, if you look at their film enough, you're going to find a handful of plays where they didn't do that, where they did let up on the ball, but we didn't make a big deal out of it because either A, they've already established their reputation as tough guys, B, they were having strong games before that happened and people wrote it off. And I think with Brian Thomas, what happened is he had 2 moments in one game for people to see, and then on top of it, he was having a bad game. So you put all that together, and people are, there's a contingent of people out there who are like, their perception of him is forever changed as a player. And I think that when you actually look at his weeks, is it possible that, from what I saw on the tape, Adam, you could see where he's mainly an outside receiver. He's mainly a boundary guy who has made his living thus far before Liam Cohen's offense, winning contested catches at the boundary. Occasionally a safety might come over and hit him as he's working over the top of a cornerback, and he's made those plays. He's at least caught the ball, even if he's pushed out of bounds. He's had more catches than drops. He hasn't alligator armed anything in those situations. But over the middle, you could see the possibility, if you want to, I'm not saying it's a fact, seeing the possibility, you could speculate that maybe he's not as comfortable over the middle. But I would say most receivers are not as comfortable over the middle in traffic with an impending brick wall coming at you at about the mile per hour rate of like a Lincoln Continental in city traffic. So it's one of those things that, does this make him a bad player? Is he a fraud that's been found out? I don't think remotely so. And maybe the wrist injury was a bullshit excuse, because from what I was watching throughout the entire game, he caught the ball just fine with his hands. He wasn't doing anything off kilter, and it wasn't even listed on the injury report. I think this was just a really bad idea. He should have just said, I had a shitty game, and Trevor and I weren't on the same page, and there were a few throws that Trevor should have. If Trevor threw the ball accurately on at least 3 of the plays I watched, Brian Thomas probably has like a 2-touchdown day and like 120 yards in addition to whatever the yardage was on that day in the first place. And I don't think we would have whispered about, well, he did have that ugly alligator arm of a play, but it's just week 2. It was a kind of a bad throw. We would have made a very different assumption about all this.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of Mike Evans. And some years Mike Evans has terrible hands, and some years Mike Evans has great hands. And it seems to be weirdly correlated whether he had like a 2-drop game on national television in week 3 that year or not. Mike Evans drops 2 passes on national TV, and the discourse is about how terrible his hands are. And then, he goes a couple of years without any drops on a major nationally televised game. Plenty of drops, but in games people aren't watching because, it's the Bucs.
CeeDee Lamb this year.
Right, exactly. It's a question of salience. If you don't see it happen, it didn't happen. Yeah. Which is very convenient for players who screw up on games people aren't watching. Less convenient for players who screw up on games people are watching. Yeah. I mean, if I were to advance 2 hypotheses, I would say my hypothesis is that Brian Thomas is not soft. I would
agree with that.
No player in the NFL is soft.
Yeah.
Like even punters and kickers, I wouldn't be willing to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an inherent level of toughness in everyone there. And then second of all, I think that sometimes players are different from each other. Like Deion Sanders did not like tackling the ball carrier.
Nope.
Champ Bailey did like tackling the ball carrier. I don't think that's a reflection on Deion Sanders or Champ Bailey, other than the fact that they are, in fact, different people. And you shouldn't expect Champ Bailey to be Deion Sanders any more than you should expect Deion Sanders to be Champ Bailey, any more than you should expect Brian Thomas to be Austin Collie or whoever. Like players are going to play.
Franco Harris ran out of bounds. Jim Brown didn't believe that the boundary was an excuse for anything.
Right. Marvin Harrison, like he just loved running those boundary routes and then stepping out, getting the first down, stepping out and going right back to the line of scrimmage. And you know what? They got a lot of first downs that way. That was a very successful thing. And he stayed healthy.
Torrey Holt used to hit the ground as soon as he caught the ball.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, that's fine. Like, sure, it would be nice if Torrey Holt was legging out a few extra yards after the catch. But, you know, the players are who they are. As much as I wished Demaryius Thomas played like the huge receiver that he was, how I wish he had like that bully mentality. He didn't have that bully mentality, but he was still a really good receiver at the things that he did and the things he was temperamentally suited for. And you know, like you can wish all you want that Brian Thomas was someone else, but I happen to like Brian Thomas. I think he's a really good receiver, and I'm kind of content with the player that he is.
Yeah. I mean, but you know, we like to label things very early and go about that. I mean, another one that I saw today was some rumor from a site that I won't even deign. I just happened to see it because whenever I go on Instagram, there's an ad for it that I see, and it's usually some salacious thing like, thought is that Ashton Jeanty is already earning the Trent Richardson label, you know, after his initial 2 weeks of the season. And I remember when Jonathan Taylor had Colts fans earning the Trent Richardson label.
Oh, I love the Trent Richardson label. Yeah, I did a look at this years back about like young running backs with a huge workload and a terrible yard per carry, and like 98% of them went on to be superstars, and 2% of them went on to be Trent Richardson. So like, give me all of those: Le'Veon Bell, Jonathan Taylor, LaDainian Tomlinson, Matt Forte, Walter Payton, Emmitt Smith, Marshawn Lynch. Like, go look at their rookie year workload and yards per carry, and then tell me that you're worried about Ashton Jeanty not having all these explosive plays already.
Yeah, and it's funny because I literally told people this year, I'm like, expect him to have a LaDainian Tomlinson rookie year, which is people are going to whine about it, and then you're going to look at it deeper and go, okay, if you watch the film, you'll see a very talented player who's just needs more help and more experience acclimating to what is going to be asked of him. But you know, what about concerns that people have about him? I had a fun debate with Raiders 365 on X because he was like, well, you know, they removed his responsibilities from pass protection and third down, and they gave roles to Zamir White in short yardage, and they used Dylan Lobby, you know, in the 2-minute drill. Is that really worth a sixth overall pick, you know, for a player that they're removing him from high leverage situations? Is that really what you want from a 6th overall pick? And I'm thinking, well, Adrian Peterson, you know, had Chester Taylor in front of him, you know, and he only started 9 games, you know, in his first year. Adrian Peterson also fumbled the ball 20 times in his first 3 years. But they knew what kind of talent they had. But they're going to, you know, what people forget is, from my standpoint, Adam, is that when you have some competent players or players that you can get involved competently at a certain level where your rookie is weaker at, that you let those players ramp up and work at getting better at that and give somebody else those responsibilities. That does not mean that, I mean, to me that's reasonable. Now, to others, they go, well, if I got a 6th overall pick, he should be Superman right away and be able to do everything.
And it gets too that, football is weird. Over short timelines, weird stuff happens. Players play in roles that maybe we weren't expecting, but over a long timeline, players tend to find. Hang on, did I lose you there?
No, I'm here. I'm still
Oh,
here.
okay, yeah. Sorry, you were just holding very still. I didn't realize I was that interesting. You were wrapped. I thought my screen was glitching out.
I didn't interrupt you for the first time in 10 seconds.
I don't think you've ever been that interested in anything I had to say. Over short timelines, people will be used in weird roles. Jamal Charles ran behind Thomas Jones for the Chiefs, and Jamal Charles became the only player in history, or since Beatty Feathers, I think, with over 1,000 rushing yards on under 200 carries, and he was lighting it up. And Thomas Jones was averaging like 3.2 yards per carry, and people are like, well, if Jamal Charles is so good, then why is he in this role right now? Roles change. People find themselves in a number of situations and roles for a number of reasons. It might be coaching incompetence or malpractice. That's not as common as people think, but it does happen where coaches put players in bad situations or put them in situations that they're not really well suited for. Sometimes it's you're just developing as a player. Sometimes it's earning trust. Sometimes it's for any number of reasons. But one of the things that I very firmly believe is that over long timelines, people find themselves where in the right role. That a lot of that tends to even out. And if Ashton Jeanty is going to be a great pass protector down the line, he will be in on passing situations down the line. And if he's not going to be a great pass protector down the line, then they'll probably still have somebody else who's helping out in that role. But that doesn't necessarily disqualify him from fantasy success or even strong team value. Like lots of teams have had two running backs, and that's been okay. I'm reminded of the Dolphins with Ronnie Brown and Ricky Williams. It didn't diminish either of them as players, the fact that they were sharing the field with each other, because that was what was best for the Dolphins, that you're using each player to their specific strengths, and it worked out tremendously for them.
Oh, it's absolutely. And there's players that you look at their, Barry Sanders, they decided to take out at the goal line. Was that maybe the best idea? I don't know. It's debatable. A lot of people would say no, they should have put him in, but they felt like they needed a role for somebody else. Maybe they felt there was a high chance for injury in a compressed area of the field, and they wanted to keep him fresh, and they wanted to have, or they wanted to limit the potential for injuries in certain situations. Maybe you had a hard-headed coach at one point who decided that that's how he wanted things to go. You look at, I look at Nick Chubb, and I think you got him in the second round, but you're going to use him on punt return duty to begin the year, because he's your third string running back. Is that a good judgment of talent? Things like that happen.
I love when teams use like actual players, like top starters. I love when they use them on special teams, and I strongly believe that more teams should be willing to do this. I think the injury concerns are overstated, and the advantage of having, like Alvin Kamara could have gone down as like a Cordero Patterson level kickoff returner. Sure. I strongly believe this. He could have gone down as one of the best kickoff returners of all time. And I get that, he's very important to your offense. And especially this was back under the old kickoff when the injury rates were a bit higher. And I understand the decision to move him off, but also that comes with a cost. Like the Saints gave up a lot of yards of field position over the year, and multiple touchdowns by having somebody other than Alvin Kamara do it. So I love when I would love more teams putting guys like Nick Chubb's on punt returns. I think the league would be so much more exciting if they did.
I would agree if he was the return man and not one of the actual like blockers that was up front.
Yeah,
that's how they were.
Never
using
mind.
him.
I wasn't.
But I know. But
dumb.
I understand it. It's a natural assumption because and he wasn't even a starter at that point. They had some. They just finally started to give him some opportunities due to injury, if I remember correctly, and then he took off, and they realized what they had. But you see some situations like that over time that are, that can be a little bit puzzling.
But dumb coaches lose jobs.
True.
Coaches who are doing puzzling things typically are not long for the league. Either their puzzling things are genius and they're going to work out and the coach is going to stick, or they're really as dumb as they seem and the coach is going to fail terribly and they're going to bring in a new coach. And if the current coach is doing really bizarre, puzzling things, odds are the new coach is going to be, more of a return to normalcy and sanity and rationality.
So I want to run something by you because Brandon Angelo and I had this conversation last night on our Q&A show from our listeners, and they were asking us a lot of questions about the Bears. And one of the things that we were having fun with was talking about how, I brought up the point that Ben Johnson is literally managing upward not only to his executive staff and his GM, but also to the media and the fans. He's literally trying to reinvent, create a new culture in Chicago, and that takes time. And part of what takes time is that you're dealing with high-paid players like DJ Moore, who had an extension, DeAndre Swift, who was taken ahead of Saquon Barkley because he was cheaper, and they felt like that they could get as much out of him. And those were Ryan Poles' decisions. And I wonder if you think this theory is an interesting one, whether you agree with it or not. But Ryan Poles, as a scout, according to Brandon, he's a height, weight, speed guy. That's always been his thing. And so what we've seen with Bears draft picks up until Ben Johnson, and even with Ben Johnson only getting a couple of his guys, has been height, weight, speed guys. I mean, like Velus Jones in the third round is a good example of that. And there are some other guys that fit that very easily as the height, weight, speed guy. I just wonder, do you think because Ryan Poles was an offensive lineman, and offensive linemen are probably the ones who are most strictly graded to have like a barrier to entry based on height, weight, speed? Do you think that him being a lineman has influenced his ability to do this because he's like applying what was done with him to everyone across the board in a slapdash sort of way?
I mean, this gets back to the nature of randomness. Like, yes, obviously, Ryan Poles' formative experiences have had a strong impact on how he manages teams today. But do I think that like offensive linemen in general would be predisposed to this? I mean, I could give you easy counterexamples like Billy Beane with the Oakland A's, very famously. Like, he was like the underwear Olympics guy. He was the height, weight, speed guy, and he crashed out of the Major League Baseball. And so he specifically went out of his way to get guys who didn't look like that. And so it could have been the same thing to Ryan Poles, where like, oh yeah, everybody was drafting linemen based on height, weight, speed, but I saw the guys that stuck around were the scrappy guys, and so I'm going the other way. So I would agree that like, yes, every incident in Ryan Poles' life has shaped the human that he is today, but I don't think that this is one of those models that explains everything but predicts nothing. Right. So I don't know that it's predictively useful. I will say I think it's bizarre, and this is not unusual. I think NFL teams make a lot of bizarre decisions, but I thought it was bizarre that they kept Poles around and that he managed to survive that relatively unscathed. We'll see if it works out for them in terms of, models that explain everything but predict nothing. My model predicts that this whole Ryan Poles marriage is not going to end super well. I think they're probably going to be in the market for a new GM in a year or two anyway, and they probably should have gotten a head start on that. But the nice thing about predictions is, if they're wrong, it's an opportunity to learn and grow and make better predictions down the line.
Yeah, I mean, most teams, you'll talk to most guys who, Dan Hatman is a good example of, at the Scouting Academy, former scout with the Eagles and with the Giants, and he talks about that really it's ideal that you pair a GM and coach as new hires so that they can get to work together and you try and create a marriage that you think is going to be worthwhile. That's the ideal way to go. If you bring in a coach with a lame duck GM or vice versa, it kind of undermines things and gets political. And you could see how maybe there's thoughts that the team split the draft picks between Ben getting a couple of his guys early, and then Poles doing what he wanted to do late. And
Which is super functional. That's
Yeah.
definitely how most functional organizations operate.
Right, exactly.
There's no consensus building. It's just you get yours, I'll get mine, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Let's have a contest.
Yep.
That's going to work really well. And then you're seeing it play out on the field a little bit, because you could make the theory that DJ Moore, who has been a good receiver, in the NFL, but it may not be the ideal receiver for Ben Johnson's system, because as much as he protested about it last year to Matt Harmon in an interview during the Super Bowl, I think it was, that all these Twitter people were saying he couldn't run good routes and that he wasn't running good routes and all this stuff, and he protested that. Well, here we are last week, where it turns out that one of the pivotal plays of the game, he adjusted his route last second as Caleb Williams was throwing the ball and had to change his throw and ended up spraying the ball over him. And the quarterback fraternity of Twitter
I know, I love Ryan Fitzpatrick. I just have to say.
Yeah, me too.
Where people are blaming Williams for that, and Fitzpatrick's like, well, as an actual NFL quarterback, let me explain what happened there.
Yeah.
And then people are trying to explain football to Ryan Fitzpatrick and Kurt Warner.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it's funny because I have my whole other thought about those guys, but for the most part, what they do is very helpful and useful because they have been there. They do understand the game. They may have a limited view of how offense works in certain situations, right. Like the Anthony Richardson blindside sack. There were guys who actually coach football, who coach quarterbacks who were quarterbacks, who've been on, like the guy from Last Chance U, who is kind of how would I just joke this? He's a little gruffer than what those guys present with polish, but he was he goes, all respect to those guys. I mean, they understand quarterbacking, but they never coach quarterbacking. I would never in a million years put Anthony Richardson in the situation, or any quarterback in the situation that they're saying would have happened. And he said if it did, it was probably for them that they were allowed to do that, not some of the guys who come on air who were backup quarterbacks who would never have a chance in hell to be allowed to do some of that stuff. They would have done it. They would have put more things in place. And he said, I would never throw to I would never have a blindside hot, coming off free there and expect my guy to turn and throw into that. And he was showing the field, he showed different things with the field and showed why in theory they were wrong, I mean, and then or at least that was unlikely what they were putting out there. But when it comes to situations like what the one you're mentioning, absolutely. And there's always a common thing. I love the ones with Jeff Schwartz where they try to explain to offensive linemen about pass protections. That's one of my favorites as well. But at the same time, it is funny when you get players who come on who are like defensive backs, like Will Blackman, talking about how Nick Chubb was never going to be a starter in the league after watching a half of preseason football. And you realize you're like, well, you tackle those guys occasionally when they get into your area, or you're supposed to. But
yeah, I was about to say, you try to tackle
those guys, exactly. But, maybe you're not in the right lane there. And so it's we just have to be, again, it's the frame of reference and the perspective of these people that we always have to be careful with it. But it does make me laugh because DJ Moore, here he is protesting about routes, and there he is freelancing again at the wrong time. And that was the exact complaint levied against him last year, is that he was like a box of chocolates as a route runner. So, yeah, I mean, this whole thing, you got DeAndre Swift, who, they're leading in yards. What is it? Yards earned before contact, and then after contact, they're dead last or very close. And you could look at that and go, well, I mean, these are two of the more Ryan Poles picked players. I think that Ben Johnson, probably if he had his way, would have gotten rid of DJ Moore already. And probably we already saw that how he felt about DeAndre Swift. I mean, I know that he's like, yeah, he's fine, and we don't have much behind him that's proven. But I have a feeling that these guys are out there, and once there's enough, a couple weeks in there, that if they don't prove him wrong, you're gonna probably see a lot less work out of those two guys in the coming weeks if it continues like this.
Yeah. Regarding bringing in coaches and GMs at the same time, I don't know that I'm diehard about that. If you have like a good, stable organization and the coach leaves, like I think it would be a great boon to a first-year head coach to come into a situation where you have an established, veteran, proven
and I would agree.
General manager, totally functional. I just think, to me, football is such a high entanglement sport, and we've talked about that before, that it's so difficult to parse credit and blame a lot of the time, especially to like a lay outside observer. And for coaches and general managers, it's even harder because they don't directly impact anything on the field. They only have indirect impacts. And so my philosophy, if I ever make billions of dollars and buy an NFL team, is when things go bad, if I'm trying to parse out credit and blame for why they went bad, I'm much more likely to get that wrong than get that right. And so, fair or not, if you have a situation where you're like, this is super dysfunctional and we need to change it, I would just clean house rather than trying to say it's super dysfunctional and this person is responsible, but that person is not responsible. And that might be the reality. It might have been that Eberflus was responsible and Poles was not responsible. And if so, well, I'm sorry, that sucks for Poles that I'm giving him the blame that he doesn't deserve. But my goal as an owner isn't to be maximally fair to everyone. It's to maximize my chances of creating a compelling product. And so I'm a big believer in this whole like piecemeal replacement thing is just a recipe for disaster, because then it's difficult enough to find good replacements, but then you're adding this extra layer of complexity where like now you're responsible for apportioning blame. So yeah, I don't really believe in like scapegoats. Like we'll fire this guy and give this guy another chance. Just if you're going to clean house, just clean house and start new.
Yeah, I can understand that. That makes sense to me. Now, when you talk about organizational value, it just depends on what you're trying to be. If you're Jerry Jones, apparently they're deriving high value from just basically being the version of the tabloid on the supermarket stands, because they don't win, but they're compelling. Every week, people are talking about them.
Any change in Dallas is necessarily going to be piecemeal because Jerry Jones would never clean house. That would involve firing Jerry Jones, and he's never going to do that.
Yeah, because Jerry Jones is the assistant to the regional manager as a coach. You know, he's a scout. He's everything. I think he has uniforms in his closet for everything that he is. Because I'm after watching this Netflix Cowboys thing, I'm being reminded of what he was doing with Jimmy Johnson. He might as well be the DuPont heir with the wrestler. Other than that, thank God he's not a murderously unstable
that we know of.
That we know of. Yeah, that's true. He may take him out there to that deer stand, but and we never hear from them again. But no, I mean that's the thing with Jerry is just like. There's a little creepiness going on in there that you got rid of a coach like that. I forgot all about that whole Jimmy Johnson saga. I mean, like I remember being mad about it, but after seeing it again, reviewing, I was like, wow, it's almost it's just sad that Jerry was like dressing up in a coach's outfit and going over there and with Barry Switzer on the sideline knew, and Barry going, no, we don't do that, Jerry. No, because Jerry was suggesting putting a player somewhere in the practice. That was just utterly ridiculous. And he was like, no, we don't do that in football, and you could tell Jerry was like still trying to, assert his authority on a practice field. And you're just like, dude, you're the owner of the team. Just do what you were supposed to be doing. You were doing fine before your ego got involved.
Well, I don't know if he was doing fine, but it was easier to manage you out of the way.
Yeah.
we gave you like, hey, Jerry, here's a very important task that we need you to accomplish.
Yeah.
It's like sending the father off to get ice chips when his wife's giving birth. You're just getting him out of the room.
Well, I mean, in terms of making the Cowboys a compelling product off the field and what they did with TV revenue and getting Fox involved in the bidding and all the things that have to do with how the NFL really makes money, he's done his share. It looks like he's done his share of that. Now, fortunately for the NFL, they don't have any competition for the on-field products except themselves, and because they split everything, the way they do, there's really no compelling reason to have a winning football team. Relative to TV deals and the fact that their stadiums are subsidized by the public. And, so in that respect, yeah, if somehow you and I could somehow get billions and create a football league that could be competition for, actually be competitive in getting good player talent and taking that away from the NFL or threatening it, and we don't end up lawyered out of the league, or lawyered out of existence for doing it, maybe the NFL at some point would have to, start focusing on how do we develop players, how do we make a compelling product that's on the field, because we need, not only are we competing with each other, but we're competing with a completely different league. But we know that would never happen.
It's happened twice.
Yeah, it didn't sustain itself. That's true. One of them did.
In the 70s, there was a league called the World Football League.
Zonka.
Come in.
Yeah.
And they're like, after they folded, they like a lot of their documents came out, and it turns out like their entire strategy was basically, we're going to sign Joe Namath. And like step 2 was like question mark, and step 3 was profit. But they basically hinged there, and people like talk about like Joe Namath like being in the Hall of Fame. Oh, he's the worst quarterback in the Hall of Fame, which isn't true. They just don't understand how to look at results from that era and really understand what they're saying. But also, like, you have to remember, when Joe Namath was washed up, knees were shot, kind of a replacement level quarterback, end of his career, everybody knew it was the end. There was a rival football league whose entire competitive strategy was basically like, well, if we can get Joe Namath, something interesting might happen. Like, that was legitimately a thing where people don't, like, there's nobody in the league today. Patrick Mahomes doesn't have that kind of level of fame and clout and draw.
That's because they've neutered the personalities of all their players because of the way that they wanted everyone to look and act the same way. They've done that, and that's what they get, is a league with no personality.
I don't know, though. I mean, yes, that's happening, but also, like, there wasn't anyone like Joe Namath before Joe Namath either. I tend to think that Joe Namath was just Joe Namath, and there's just not another. That you don't get very many Joe Namaths. If you're lucky, you'll get one. The World Football League was not lucky. But I think that should be our plan, is we should start saving our money. And the next time there's a Joe Namath level player, we can start a league and try to sign him away and maybe succeed if we manage to get that one player.
Yeah, but we would have to then get Ric Flair to still be alive, and to be like our party host and recruiting the Joe Namath like player, because if he was like Joe Namath, that would mean that we need to have a Ric Flair cutting promos talking about how if they wanted to ride Space Mountain, that he would be at the Marriott on Peachtree on Monday night, no wives, no girlfriends, and then there'd be a line out the door, and then the Joe Namath player might actually decide to sign with our league at that point.
Yeah, I'm not nearly as old as you are, so I didn't get that reference at all.
That's okay. I don't have any. I clearly don't have any friends who are in quantum physics, so I didn't really give a fuck about that either. But but we each have parts of our audience that come to join us here, and enjoy us either mixing or doing this, or just looking at each other like, where the fuck did that come from?
Don't diminish the role of hate watching. I'm sure we have a pretty large segment who just like yelling at the screen about how big of idiots we are.
They might. Fair play. They might, but if they do, then maybe I'm just deluded, because the emails I get on this show tend to be very complimentary to what's going on. You would think that they would be they would be acting that way. But maybe this one will get them to finally open up and reveal their true feelings.
If you are listening and you think Matt and I are idiots, please don't be shy about letting us know.
What's your email address, Adam?
It's Waldman at footballguys.com.
See, this is what we have to deal with, folks. This is what we have to contend with. But we enjoy doing it every week. And thank you for listening. Again, thank you for, to Adam for providing the content that he does at Football Guys and, agreeing to be on this show and having the opportunity for us to just chat things up and see what we come up with next. And we hope that you enjoyed it. And we'll see you next week.